Let me be blunt with you right now, because what is unfolding in the Strait of Hormuz today is not a shipping dispute. It is not a diplomatic standoff, and it is not some regional flare-up that the talking heads on cable news will have forgotten about by next week. What is happening right now in that 21-mile wide channel between Iran and Oman is the most dangerous naval confrontation the United States has stumbled into since the Cold War. And I mean that with every ounce of my professional experience behind it, having served in military intelligence, having watched American administrations manufacture crises and then fumble their way through them. I can tell you with absolute certainty that the people in Washington right now do not fully grasp what they have walked into. And by the time I am finished, you will understand exactly why that should terrify you. A tanker has been struck near the Strait of Hormuz. American guided missile destroyers have crossed into the Persian Gulf. Iran's military command has issued a formal declaration that any foreign warship approaching that waterway can and will be attacked. 2 American-flagged merchant vessels have already transited the strait under what the Trump administration is calling Project Freedom. And somewhere near the port of Jask, there is a fog of war so thick that Washington and Tehran are giving the world 3 completely different versions of what just happened to an American naval vessel. Let me walk you through every single layer of this crisis, because the mainstream media is giving you the headline without giving you the architecture underneath it. And the architecture is where the real danger lives. Start with the Baraka. On Monday morning, an empty crude oil tanker affiliated with the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company was struck by 2 drones as it moved through the strait. The United Arab Emirates did not mince words. Abu Dhabi's foreign ministry formally accused Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, called it a terrorist attack, and invoked United Nations Security Council Resolution 28117 on freedom of navigation. The crew survived. The ship was unloaded at the time of the strike. And that last detail matters enormously because it tells you something critical about Iranian intent. When you are trying to sink ships and cause maximum economic damage, you hit full tankers. When you are trying to send a message, when you are trying to demonstrate capability and resolve without triggering an immediate shooting war, you hit an empty hull. Iran hit an empty hull. That was not an accident. That was a carefully calibrated signal to Washington, to Abu Dhabi, and to every shipping company on earth that has a vessel anywhere near that strait. So the message was simple. We can reach you. We will reach you. And next time, we choose the payload. Now let me tell you about Project Freedom, because the name is doing a tremendous amount of political work that the operational reality simply cannot support. This operation began on Monday, May 4th, 2026, with a Truth Social post from President Donald Trump, who described it as a humanitarian gesture aimed at freeing neutral and innocent shipping, trapped inside the Gulf since the war began on February 28th. CENTCOM Commander Admiral Brad Cooper called it a defensive mission, essential to regional security and the global economy. And I want you to hold both of those descriptions in your mind while I give you the actual numbers, because the numbers tell a completely different story. 15,000 United States service members, guided missile destroyers, more than 100 land and sea-based aircraft, multi-domain unmanned platforms layered across an operational theater that sits directly inside Iran's declared exclusion zone. I have been around military operations my entire professional life. I know what a humanitarian convoy looks like. What CENTCOM just pushed into the Persian Gulf is not a humanitarian convoy. It is the largest American military deployment into a single Gulf choke point in years. And it is sitting on top of a naval blockade of Iranian ports that has been running since April 13th. A blockade that CENTCOM itself confirmed had turned back 48 commercial vessels in just the previous 20 days. You do not escort innocent ships with a war fleet. You escort a political objective with a war fleet and call it humanitarian, so the press does not ask the hard questions. And the hard questions are everywhere you look in this operation. Secretary of State Marco Rubio approved something called the Maritime Freedom Construct in late April. It is a coordination architecture that ties partner nations, insurance companies, and shipping organizations into a unified operational picture. Russia is excluded, China is excluded, Belarus is excluded, Cuba is excluded. Let me be clear about what that means in plain strategic language. This is not a multilateral freedom of navigation exercise. This is a sanctions regime with a naval component, dressed up in the language of international law, and it is being built at the same moment that American destroyers are pushing into waters that Iran has declared a military control zone. That is not de-escalation. That is the architecture of confrontation. But here is the piece that Washington has been the quietest about, and it is the piece that matters most. According to a senior United States official cited by Axios, the rules of engagement for American forces in the region were quietly changed in the hours before Project Freedom went live. Those new rules authorize American forces to strike what they classify as immediate threats to ships crossing the strait. That includes IRGC fast boats. That includes Iranian shore-based missile positions. Read that again carefully. The label on the operation says humanitarian. The authorities underneath that label authorize offensive strikes against Iranian military assets. Trump's own Truth Social post warned that any interference would be dealt with forcefully. The Pentagon told CNN the operation is not a traditional escort mission. The Wall Street Journal described it as a coordination cell with American forces standing by to react. 3 different framings of the same operation, and every single one of them is technically accurate because all 3 things are simultaneously true. That is how you build political cover for military action. You make the label soft enough to satisfy the press and the rules hard enough to actually fight. Stay with me, because what Iran has built to meet this operation on the other side of that strait is something that the Pentagon absolutely does not want to read out loud at a press briefing. And I am going to lay it out for you in the kind of detail that only comes from understanding how military systems actually work. Hours before American forces moved into the Gulf, Major General Ali Abdullahi, the commander of Iran's Qatam al-Anbiya Central Headquarters, the joint coordination body overseeing Iran's entire war effort, issued a written statement. The security of the Strait of Hormuz, he said, sits in the hands of Iran's armed forces. Safe transit only takes place through coordination with those forces. Any foreign armed force, and he named the United States military explicitly, would be attacked if it intended to approach or enter the strait. That is not a press release. That is an operational order, dressed in diplomatic language. and every professional military analyst reading it knows exactly what it means. Iran has declared a control zone. Iran is enforcing a control zone, and any vessel or warship that enters that zone without Tehran's explicit permission is now, under Iran's declared legal framework, a legitimate military target. Abraham Azizi, the head of Iran's Parliamentary National Security and Foreign Policy Committee, went even further. He framed American activity in the Strait not as a routine naval presence, but as a violation of the ceasefire that is held since April 8th. The Strait of Hormuz, he said, would not be managed by Trump's delusional posts. Now I want you to pay very close attention to the specific legal framing that Iran is using here, because it is far more sophisticated than anything the Western press is giving them credit for. Iran is not saying American ships are unwelcome. Iran is saying American military activity constitutes a treaty breach. That is an entirely different legal and political claim, and it is one that carries serious weight in the international forums where this war's ultimate resolution will eventually be negotiated. Iran is building a legal architecture around its military posturing, and they are doing it deliberately and methodically, while Washington is busy arguing over whether a missile actually hit a warship near Jask. Which brings me to Jask and the fog of war. That is now the most dangerous space in the Persian Gulf. Iranian state-linked media claimed that a United States Navy vessel near the port of Jask ignored warnings, was struck by 2 missiles, and turned back. Fars news agency, which is directly tied to the IRGC, called it a confirmed strike. A senior Iranian official speaking to Reuters described the engagement as a warning shot and said it was unclear whether the warship had been damaged. CENTCOM spokesman Captain Tim Hawkins called the entire Iranian account propaganda, no ship hit, no ship damaged, no ship turned back. 3 versions of one event. The Iranian military framed it as enforcement. An Iranian official framed it as a warning shot. Washington framed it as fiction. And here is what my experience in military intelligence tells me about that kind of 3-way contradiction. When you have 3 competing narratives emerging simultaneously from a live operational environment, the truth is almost always somewhere in the middle. And the political damage from the ambiguity itself is already done, regardless of which version is eventually confirmed. Iran does not need to actually sink an American destroyer to reshape the rules of engagement in that strait. It only needs the world's shipping companies, the world's insurance underwriters, and the world's naval planners to believe that it might. The Jask incident, confirmed or denied, has already done that work. And the Jask incident did not stand alone on Monday. While Washington and Tehran were trading contradictory accounts of what happened near the Iranian coast, a completely separate confrontation was unfolding further along the shipping lanes. The United Kingdom Maritime Trade Operations Center, the British military body that monitors merchant shipping in the region, received a distress alert from a northbound bulk carrier that reported being approached by multiple small craft approximately 11 nautical miles west of the coastal town of Sirk. The crew was reported safe. Iran's Fars agency said the Iranian Navy had stopped the vessel for a routine documents inspection. One side called it a confrontation, the other called it routine enforcement. And that gap between those 2 descriptions is exactly the gap that Iran is exploiting to reshape the behavioral norms of every captain, every shipping company, and every insurer who has to make a decision about whether to transit the strait. Because this was not an isolated incident on Monday. It was the latest entry in a pattern that has been building for months. On April 22nd, the IRGC seized two container ships, the MSC Francesca and the Apamandas, accusing them of operating without permits under Iran's new maritime regime. A third vessel was reportedly fired upon and managed to escape. The Joint Maritime Information Center has logged at least 34 confirmed incidents involving commercial ships and offshore infrastructure across the Persian Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz, and the Gulf of Oman since the start of March. 34 confirmed incidents. The Baraka strike on Monday is the latest entry in a list that grows almost every single week. And the cumulative effect of that list on global shipping behavior is something that cannot be undone by a single American naval deployment, no matter how many destroyers Washington sends into the Gulf. But if you thought that was alarming, what I'm about to describe next is the reason why every senior naval officer in the Pentagon is losing sleep, and why the bravado coming out of the White House right now is so extraordinarily dangerous. Because the real military problem with Project Freedom is not the Iranian missiles. It is not the IRGC fast boats. It is not even the political ambiguity around JASC. The real military problem is sitting on the bottom of that strait right now, invisible, patient, and virtually impossible to clear quickly. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, two unidirectional sea lanes inside that channel normally carry approximately 20 million barrels of oil per day. Before this war began, more than 30,000 vessels transited the strait every year, with a daily average close to 138 ships. According to the Joint Maritime Information Center, that number has collapsed to a fraction of normal traffic, with only a handful of transits recorded on some recent days. And into that confined geography, Iran has deployed the cheapest, dirtiest, most asymmetric naval weapon in the modern arsenal: mines. Specifically, influence mines. The Mon 3 anchored mine. It weighs 300 kilograms. It can operate in water up to 100 meters deep. It does not need to be physically contacted to detonate. It triggers on water pressure changes or engine acoustic signatures. It sits on the seabed or rides a cable moored to it, completely invisible from the surface, undetectable by conventional navigation systems, and extraordinarily difficult to neutralize, even with dedicated mine countermeasure vessels. Open source assessments place Iran's total naval mine stockpile somewhere between 2,000 and 6,000 devices, even after American strikes in March destroyed 16 Iranian mine-laying vessels. United States intelligence assessments say Iran has retained between 80 and 90% tricks of its small boat and mine-laying capacity. CNN's reporting describes the threat envelope around the strait as a gauntlet of dispersed mine-laying craft, explosive-laden boats, and shore-based missile batteries. One unnamed analyst called the strait in its current condition, and I want you to hear this phrase clearly, a death valley. Now here is the contradiction that no one at the Pentagon wants to say out loud at a press conference. The United States Navy decommissioned its last 4 Avenger-class minesweepers, the ships based in Bahrain, specifically designed and positioned to deal with exactly this kind of threat in September of last year. The Sea Dragon airborne mine-sweeping helicopter The backbone of American airborne mine countermeasure capability for decades, was phased out in August of last year. Today, the United States Navy is relying on combat ships fitted with mine countermeasures modules as its primary mine clearance capability in the Gulf. Only one of those ships, the USS Canra, has been confirmed in the region. Independent assessments from the Foreign Policy Research Institute suggest that fully clearing the Strait of Mines under contested conditions could take up to 6 months. 6 months. While oil trades above $100 a barrel, while gasoline approaches $5 at the American pump, and while 20,000 seafarers remain stranded inside the Gulf on vessels running low on food and fuel. What Iran has done with a few $100,000 worth of seabed mines is bind a navy that costs hundreds of billions of dollars to maintain. That is the real arithmetic of Hormuz, and it does not improve for Washington over time. It gets worse. Every day that passes, every vessel that tries to transit and turns back, every insurance underwriter who adds another clause to a war risk policy, every shipping company that reroutes around the Cape of Good Hope instead of through the Strait, is another day that Iran's strategic position strengthens and America's strategic position erodes, and Project Freedom, with all its destroyers and aircraft and unmanned platforms, is sailing directly into that arithmetic without the one tool it actually needs to change it. Keep watching, because what I'm going to show you next is how Iran is now converting this temporary military leverage into something far more permanent and far more dangerous than any missile or mine. What is being drafted in Tehran's parliament right now could reshape the legal status of the world's most critical shipping lane for decades to come. And Washington is so focused on the military confrontation that it is barely paying attention to the legal trap being built around it. That is where this story truly starts to unravel.